Not even the rats stayed quiet in a medieval inn. Men fought for space, scratched until they bled, and prayed they'd wake up with all their teeth, and none of their companions' knives in their ribs. Such was the reality of spending the night in medieval inns. The road was never a choice, but a necessity. From the 13th to the 15th century, people did not travel for pleasure. They moved under duress. Merchants with cartloads of salt and wool trudging between seasonal fairs, barefoot penitents walking the spine of Europe to Santiago or Rome, mercenaries shifting from battlefield to battlefield, and fugitives fleeing not just justice, but often famine, plague, or war. Peasants left villages when they had no other option. Vagabonds moved because staying in one place meant starving, but the roads they followed barely deserved the name. By late autumn, even major routes were reduced to black rivers of churned mud. Wayfarers lost shoes in the sucking bog, carts splintered in axle-deep ruts, and animals sank belly first into the muck, sometimes drowning in it. In forests, overgrown Roman roads vanished entirely, leaving travelers to follow sun and instinct through thickets teeming with wolves and worse. Bands of thieves watched every bend, and when night fell, they did not wait. They pounced. By the hour of dusk, anyone with a coin and any sense sought walls, not comfort, but walls. That meant an inn. But inns, contrary to the fragrant lie repeated in so many painted manuscripts and modern novels, were not sanctuaries, they were businesses. Brutal, opportunistic, and usually unregulated. With towns expanding and roads dragging people across ever more dangerous distances, enterprising landlords learned quickly how to turn passing misery into steady coin. A bed, a bench, or even dry straw fetched a price. Drink cost more than bread, and for the truly desperate, even the heat of the hearth could be taxed by the hour. This was not hospitality, it was exploitation disguised as survival. There were no authorities to file complaints with if food was sour or lodging unsafe. Town statutes might name an inn among taxable properties, but seldom did they regulate how many could sleep in a single bed or whether boiled water had actually reached a boil. And so, across England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire, the inn became a space not of refuge, but of endurance. A marketplace of desperation where coin bought not peace, but a slightly better place to suffer. They were usually freestanding timber buildings, low and wide, squatting on the edge of towns or perched along roads barely wide enough for two carts. No signs hung outside. Illiteracy made painted boards a rarity, and most inns were simply known by word of mouth. The one near the church, or Old Yannick's place near the bridge. In German towns they were Herbergen, often indistinguishable from stables. In Italy they were osterie or locande, thick-walled and often hidden behind a courtyard gate. But the rules, or rather the lack thereof, remained the same everywhere. First come, first pay, first served. A Flemish pilgrim's account from 1417 survives in battered Latin. We were 16 souls on a floor of filth, yet the keeper charged us each the price of bread and broth, as if it were a bishop's feast. None dared speak ill, for he held the only keys and locked the door with us inside. Archaeological digs in southern France and along trade routes in Germany confirm this grim vision. In one inn excavated near Regensburg, beneath the rotted wood of the main hall, lay compacted strata of hair, straw, bone fragments, and human feces. The moment a traveller crossed the threshold of a medieval inn, he entered a world where the air itself seemed heavier, as if burdened by years of unspoken misery and the exhalations of 1,000 desperate souls. The smell came first, not in waves, but as a solid wall, rising from the floors and falling from the rafters in equal measure. It was a rancid fusion of boiled meat, sour sweat, damp wool, wood smoke, wet straw, spoiled fat, and rotting produce, layered so thickly in the lungs that even seasoned merchants instinctively reached for their cloaks to shield their mouths. For those newly arrived from the open road, the stench was a physical assault, one that overwhelmed the relief of shelter and replaced it with an immediate sense of entrapment. Within these walls, comfort was not only elusive, it was actively mocked by the architecture itself. Rooms were low and cramped, their timber frames bowed inward by rain and rot, while warped floorboards groaned with every step, some having gone soft from the accumulation of waste beneath. In most cases, there were no chimneys, only central hearths that vomited smoke freely into the room, its bitter haze settling into every garment, spoon, and nostril. At night, even with the fire burning, the room sank into a murk so dense that men could vanish into it within arm's reach, their voices dissolving in the slow churn of coughing, murmuring, and restless shifting. Ceilings offered no reprieve. Years of soot, tar, and cooking grease had fused into a dark crust that dangled in brittle drips. When the fire warmed the rafters, those droplets fell, slow, oily tears that landed silently on heads, tables, and the open mouths of those too weary to move. Guests who found themselves beneath the rafters for too long might feel a sudden splash on the brow, uncertain whether it came from condensation or a rat pissing from above. As for the ground underfoot, it could hardly be called a floor. In most inns, the surface was simple packed earth, overlaid with layers of rushes that were meant to absorb moisture and refuse but usually served only to conceal it. Mixed with ash, discarded bones, grease, urine, vomit, and the occasional rat corpse, the rushes turned quickly into a mulch of sickness that squelched underfoot. When they became too foul, the solution was not removal, but addition. A fresh layer was thrown atop the last, pressing the previous filth deeper into the soil and raising the ground little by little until door frames tilted, warped by their own swelling thresholds. The furnishings, meager as they were, had long ago surrendered any illusion of cleanliness or function. Tables leaned inward, held together by frayed twine or rusted nails, and benches warped by dampness wobbled under the weight of malnourished men. Each surface, wooden or cloth, was sticky with the residue of past meals, spilled ale, congealed tallow, and blood from split lips or poorly butchered animals. Some innkeepers nailed rough cloths to the table in a parody of cleanliness, but these were rarely changed, and by dusk were crawling with flies fat from the kitchen scraps nearby. But it was the sleeping arrangements that delivered the inn's most infamous insult. For all the indignities of the common room, it was in the dormitory, if it could even be called that guests truly confronted the hierarchy of survival. Beds were few, and when present at all, consisted of low wooden frames or simple piles of straw laid directly upon the ground. A few wealthier travellers might pay extra for layered pallets, straw heaped upon sackcloth, with a second layer of flattened rags to keep them above the worst of the crawling vermin and the seepage from the chamber pots. These were stacked near the fire or elevated slightly on platforms, not for comfort, but to signal that their occupants had coin worth protecting. The poor lay wherever space remained, packed like cordwood in rows that made no distinction between strangers, enemies, or the visibly ill. It was not uncommon for 6 to 8 people to share a single bed, or rather to overlap upon a single mattress, their limbs entwined without choice, their breaths indistinguishable. Valuables were clutched tightly to the chest or tied beneath tunics, but few slept soundly. Theft was constant. A London court record from 1389 describes a merchant's apprentice who awoke with bruises on his ribs, missing boots, and the rank suspicion that someone had urinated on his cloak in the night. He found no justice, only laughter and the grim advice to sleep lighter next time. Within these confines, wealth shaped not just comfort, but survival. Those with money secured places near the fire, where warmth and visibility offered a slight buffer against illness and theft. The rest made do along the damp periphery, where straw turned to sludge by midnight and rats crept across chests in search of crusts. Sleep offered no escape from the misery of a medieval inn. Even in exhaustion, guests were seldom alone, not with the bedding itself alive beneath them. When the last whispers faded and the hearth crackled low, a quieter torment took its place. Fleas stirred in the seams of mattresses, lice clung to cloaks, and bedbugs emerged from crevices in the boards to gorge themselves in silence. Their numbers were vast, their appetites tireless, and their assault relentless. No coin, no rank, no layers of straw could hold them back. Guests scratched through the night, not from idleness or madness, but desperation. They tore at bellies and thighs until the skin broke and blood flowed, seeking a moment's relief from the crawling. Fingernails split, rashes spread. In the morning, bodies bore raw tracks of red where sleep had been traded for struggle. Infection came quickly. In town hospitals from Lübeck to Milan, physicians recorded a common affliction among travelers: febris lecti, the fever of the bed. Some suspected poison in the straw, others blamed the straw itself. But everyone knew the cause, and none could avoid it. Even those who paid to sleep on elevated pallets, those who arrived with velvet cloaks and well-fed horses, suffered the same fate. Vermin climbed, jumped, and nestled in warmth, regardless of wealth. Lice tunneled through fine embroidery as easily as through sackcloth, and fleas danced from skin to skin with no regard for ownership. A merchant from Genoa wrote bitterly in 1406 that he had awakened as if gnawed by spirits, and found lice floating in his morning wash-water like grains of barley. The innkeeper offered vinegar and laughter. Beneath the beds and across the floor, rats conducted their own untroubled commerce. They gnawed at bundles, shredded linen, and chewed through jerkin sleeves in search of crumbs. In some inns, they waited until the fire burned low before emerging from the walls in visible waves. One pilgrim described their claws tapping across the floor like the devil's rosary. In plague years, they were more than a horror, they were a sentence. But even in quieter decades, they carried sickness in their fur and bit those too drunk to defend themselves. Travelers often slept with knives tucked under their cloaks, not to ward off thieves, but to cut open gnawed fabric, or, in the worst cases, poisoned flesh. At first light, if one could stomach food, the air thickened again with smoke and boiling meat. Most inns lacked anything resembling a kitchen. The hearth did all: cooking, heating, smoking, choking. Stew pots were seldom scrubbed and often black with grease from past meals. Leftovers from the previous day, if still soft, were reheated and served again. When meat was added, it was often pork cured beyond recognition, its fat yellowed and its scent sour. Poultry was rarely plucked cleanly, and more than one guest pulled feathers from their teeth between bites. Complaints were ignored or answered with foul beer. Drink offered no greater safety. Beer was stretched with ditch water or well dregs, especially in cheap inns where fuel for boiling was costly. Ale soured within days but was served warm and frothy all the same. Rainwater collected in barrels grew green with slime. Wine, when present, was more acidic than fermented. A Hungarian soldier once wrote that "I drank and saw stars, not from delight but from fever." No one doubted him. Dysentery was so common among guests that its symptoms earned no pity, only distance. Even the act of relief offered no dignity. Chamber pots, cracked, unemptied, and always overflowing, stood at the edges of every hall. Few used them. Most stepped outside in the dark, dumped waste in ditches, or emptied buckets through windows before dawn. In cities like Bruges and Cologne, laws forbade this behavior under threat of fine or flogging, but no one enforced such rules after sundown. By sunrise, the street outside the inn was a mosaic of excrement, spoiled broth, broken teeth, and straw soaked through with urine. In winter, it froze in jagged slabs. In summer, it soured and steamed. Travelers wading through it did so with heads bowed, eyes watering, boots sinking. Yet for all this, vermin, filth, sickness, and stench, the inn remained not a final resort, but often the only one. The sun brought no comfort. With morning light came bruises, blood, and the sullen recognition that a new day had begun in the same filth where the last had ended. Inns, for all their supposed civility, were not sanctuaries but stages for violence, spontaneous or calculated, impulsive or planned, but always present just beneath the surface of fatigue and fermented rage. Cramped bodies, sour ale, and bad sleep did not mix well with strangers, pressed elbow to elbow in smoky darkness. A careless word or drunken glance was often enough to ignite fists. Blades followed soon after. Blood spilled into straw that had already soaked up worse, and by dawn the bodies were dragged into alleys or cellars, their absence explained with shrugs. Many inns concealed their dead well enough. Some had trap doors beneath the main room, leading to crude holding pits that stank of rot. Others relied on darkness and noise, trusting that a groan would be mistaken for drunken sleep, or that a missing guest would not be missed until it was too late. Robbery was almost guaranteed. Cut purses worked the crowd, while their companions created distractions with shouted boasts or staged brawls. Pilgrims and foreign merchants, those with the most coin and least local protection, were frequent targets. Valuables hidden in boots or sewn into sleeves often vanished before morning, while the victims, battered and robbed, found no sympathy from hosts more interested in avoiding trouble than resolving it. In some cases, the innkeeper himself played both sides, offering a guest safety while quietly alerting local thieves to the prize that had just arrived. More dangerous still was the figure who ruled the inn, not with warmth or hospitality, but with quiet cunning. The innkeeper was rarely just a man who served food and drink. He was often a judge, a merchant, an informer, and in certain places a silent executioner. He kept ledgers in one hand and a cudgel in the other, balanced debts with bribes, and chose which fights to break and which to let finish. A sharp host knew who worked for the local reeve, which noble's bastard son had slipped in through the back, and when to serve watered wine or poison. To run an inn was not to offer rest, it was to manage risk, secrets, and survival on a knife's edge. Disease respected none of it. Inns, especially those along trade routes and pilgrimage roads, became breeding grounds for death long before the term epidemiology existed. A single sick guest could infect a dozen before morning. Tuberculosis, typhoid, and sweating sickness drifted from mouth to mouth on clouds of steam and song. But it was plague, silent, swift, and impossible to contain, that turned these dens of transit into tombs. When Black Death returned in cycles, towns tried to quarantine infected inns, nailing doors shut and abandoning everyone inside. Survivors clawed at shutters for days. Chronicles from Siena and London speak of nights when whole buildings fell silent, not from sleep but from death. The fire burning low over a room full of corpses whose fingers still curled around empty cups. Guests who heard a cough in the night often stood and left without a word, preferring the wolves and cold outside to the certainty of what awaited indoors. And still, amid the filth and fear, there were women. Some came seeking wages, widows, abandoned daughters, and spinners drawn from nearby villages to work as serving girls. They carried pails, stirred pots, wiped tables, and endured groping hands with the same weary stoicism they had learned in fields and homes. Their pay was meager, their hours endless, their safety non-existent. At night, many were forced to sleep in corners or beside the door, where strangers could stumble over them without seeing their faces. Others came under worse terms. In most towns, inns blurred easily into brothels. A girl might be called a serving maid by day and expected to serve in darker ways by night. Payment went to the innkeeper, protection rarely did. Some were pressed into this work by desperation, others by outright force. In Avignon and Prague, laws required respectable inns to separate women from male lodgers, but these rules were flouted more often than enforced. The threat of rape was constant, the reality more frequent still. And yet not all women were victims. A rare few ran the inns themselves, widows who inherited licenses, wives left behind by traders, or cunning matriarchs who learned the rhythms of threat and profit well enough to bend them. These women fought not only for coin, but for space, against men who questioned their authority, against lawmen who mistrusted them, and against a world that saw their power as temporary and improper. Records from Ghent, Bologna, and York show names repeated over decades, women who survived fire, plague, and riot, and still collected payment for beer, bread, and beds crawling with lice. He was the quiet center of the storm. The innkeeper, Rarely the most brutal man in the room, but always the most dangerous. Behind the soot-smudged face and coarse apron, he kept a mental ledger more precise than any written book. He knew who had coin and who only pretended. He knew which guests to flatter and which to watch. His ears, always open, caught more in a single evening than most magistrates learned in a week of interrogation. To run an inn was to walk the tightrope between profit and peril. One misjudged guest, one unpaid debt, one blade drawn too soon, and the balance collapsed. A good innkeeper learned when to intervene and when to turn away. He fed bandits and bishops alike, sometimes in the same room, sometimes from the same pot. He might spy for the local bailiff one day, then offer sanctuary to a fugitive the next, charging double for the risk. Morality was a luxury no inn could afford. Pragmatism, honed to a lethal edge, was the rule of the house. Some cultivated a kind of false warmth, spinning stories by firelight and clapping shoulders with practiced familiarity. Others ruled by presence alone, standing silent in doorways with arms crossed and eyes sharp, calculating each word before it left their lips. All understood the same truth. Their power was not in hospitality, but in leverage. They knew where every purse was hidden, which guests were armed, who slept deepest, and who might not wake. In the cities, some were educated enough to keep records. In the countryside, memory was all that kept the blood from spilling faster than the ale. But still, despite the filth, the lice, the sickness, and knives, people came. They came because the world outside was worse. Wolves did not negotiate. Forests did not offer fire. Rain did not spare the soaked and freezing. On the open road, a man might lose direction, suffer a broken limb, or fall into a ditch and die alone, his body covered in leaves and forgotten before the week was out. In winter, exposure came faster than sleep. In summer, thirst burned quicker than hunger. The inn was not refuge. It was a lesser sentence. To choose it was not to seek comfort, but to avoid extinction. Those who slept within its walls gambled against murder, disease, and theft. But outside, there was only silence, unlit roads, and the slow gnaw of desperation. A man alone on the road had no witness, no shelter, and no final word. A man in an inn, at least, had a roof, however rotten, and the warmth of other bodies to keep him breathing until morning. Misery was communal, and in the darkest nights, that was worth something. Yet centuries later, we remember these places differently. Romantic paintings show rosy-cheeked travelers lifting tankards beside blazing hearths, flirtatious maids leaning over polished tables, and dogs curled peacefully beneath benches. Novels transform the chaos into camaraderie, the danger into adventure. The shadows are softened, the screams erased. Even modern films, when they nod to medieval life, render the inn as a place of ribald laughter and harmless mischief. A stage for roguish charm, not survival. The truth, filth, fever, screams in the night, and the constant scraping at skin, is pushed aside. In its place, we build a fantasy of wood smoke and worn stone, where the ale is strong, the beds are dry, and no one ever dies before dessert. This false memory has endurance. It comforts us to imagine the past as a cruder version of our present, slower perhaps and dirtier, but still familiar. Yet the truth of the medieval inn, like so much of history, defies that comfort. It was not merely unsanitary, it was dangerous, dehumanizing, and inescapable. And still, they endured. Merchants passed through and came again. Pilgrims limped in with broken sandals and left with blisters sealed in scabs. Prostitutes survived night after night, laughing through bloodied lips, measuring each new bruise against the coin it earned. Women who owned these dens of filth outlived 3 husbands and 10 plagues. Boys arrived with nothing and left as men, scarred, wiser, and still breathing. To last one night was not just luck. It was a testament to human resilience, to the ancient stubborn instinct to survive in any place where light and breath could still be shared. Even in a room of strangers. Even when the rats would not sleep. If you enjoyed this story, trust me, the next ones will be even more powerful. You're about to hear things no one else is telling. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss what's coming. If this video moved you, leave a like and drop a comment, and most importantly, share it with someone you care about. See you in the next video.